Bonjour mon ami, je suis Ronnie Okuli. Today I'm going to talk about history of law enforcement in the West. But first, I think it's important to define government, as they're the body that makes the laws that have to be enforced. The job of government, as I always understood it, was to exist purely to protect the citizens. It could also be referred to as the steering mechanism of a given society, and it's primarily responsible for public policy, in the form of laws obviously, and for protecting its citizens from foreign invaders, and that would be through the army. There is a lot of material out there on the military histories of given societies, so I'm going to focus on the policy, the laws, and how they were enforced. The first stop on our journey is going to be Babylon, one of the successors of the Akkadian Empire, and specifically a man named Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi started to invade different places around Mesopotamia and expand his empire. And so in response to that, he wanted to create a law system that everybody could agree to and follow relatively well. And to do this, he wrote the Code. Apparently, there was a quote. The reason of the Code is to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked person and the evildoer, that the strong not injure the weak. That tells a lot about Hammurabi, especially compared to some of the later centuries and even some of the laws today that seem, if not outright do, protect the rich and the strong and force the poor and the weak down into oppression and off to the side where they just can't be bothered with. Now, one of the big things that people associate with the Hammurabi Code is an eye for an eye, applied to equals. It's also worth noting that if somebody brought false claims, they would be subject to the punishment that they were either asking for or that was due somebody committing the act they are trying to bring up. One of the other important things that the Hammurabi Code did was punishment adjustment based on class. If you were poor, a slave, the punishments for an equal were usually less. If you were a rich person, and you harmed another rich person in some way, shape, or form, the punishment was usually harsher. They also had a concept of strict liability. One of the major examples of this was in the case of a doctor. If a doctor did something that caused harm to a patient, for example, the patient died, then the doctor would get their hands cut off. You might want to look into some insurance there. One of the major issues with the Hammurabi Code is there does not seem to have been any formal enforcement. There were nothing like a police force. It was likely that the army or the soldiers of the king would enforce whatever laws needed to be enforced. But for the most part, it was probably up to the citizens to get reparations. And that's actually a very big theme throughout a lot of this history. After the Hammurabi Code, we're going to go over to Egypt. And there, we're going to find out some exciting new things. They did have a police force. In the capital cities of Cairo and other larger population areas, Egypt employed public slaves to do the law enforcement, to apprehend criminals, and to enforce peace at rallies. Outside of the high population areas, foreigners were used, specifically Nubian Medjays. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Nubian Medjays and occasionally bowmen from the army would be tasked with apprehending bandits or enforcing peace along the borders and in smaller towns and just in the countryside in general. They were overseen by officers appointed by whoever was in charge of the area, generally a pharaoh. One of the examples that I saw was actually a stable hand for one of the kings who was given an appointment as what would effectively be a police chief just because the king knew him and liked him. One of the other things Egypt did was bail. They had a concept of taking somebody into the protection of another individual, and the other individual being responsible for the actions of the first. If they did not show up, then that person could be probably arrested or fined in some way. Interrogations were essentially torture, and the only way to extract information that was deemed appropriate at the time. However, most offenses were dealt with through mediation. A large portion of the time, the government and policing forces did not have to even get involved. If they were, however, there were several punishments that could be put in place. It's worth noting a gaol prison was not usually used as a punishment. They were usually holding cells to keep people there until a punishment could be chosen, or until a court date could be given. The most common punishments I could find included death by impalement, which was a slow, painful, pulling somebody down on a spear type death. Mutilation through the cutting of either the nose or the ears to mark somebody as a criminal. And just general beatings. Nice, quick, except for the death by impalement. Just get it over with and move on to something else. We're going to go a little north now and visit Greece, specifically Athens, where again public slaves were used as crowd control and arresting forces. Civilian investigations had to be conducted. The police forces in Greece did not do any investigations. It obviously means a lot of the time criminals would probably get away with what they did unless the harmed party decided to go a little touchy on the subject. For this, see many Greek tragedy plays. If a court date was opted to be necessary, the magistrate, who is not a judge, would oversee the proceedings just to make sure civil order was kept. And a jury of 200 or so, sometimes up to 600, would decide the outcome of the trial. It's worth noting, in order to qualify to be on the jury, you had to be at least 30 years old. If a verdict was reached of guilty, the most common punishments were exile or death. Again, nice and quick, no prison, don't have to deal with them in the long run. One of the things that I found is a name for the public slaves who did the policing duties was rod bearers, which indicates they were one of the earliest people to use some form of short stick-like weapon to apprehend people non-lethally, which only makes sense. The point of them was to apprehend people, and they were slaves. Don't want to give slaves weapons to post a revolt. That could end up being bad.
Sorry for the lateness of this video. Join me next time for part 2, starting with the Roman Empire and continuing on until the modern day.